She didn't scream. That was the first thing that broke him. Eleanor Whitaker lay on the floor of her own cabin, blood on her lip, fire in her eyes. And she didn't scream. She reached. For the shotgun. For anything. For a woman who had nothing left, she still refused to stop fighting. That's where this story begins. Not with a rescue. With a widow who was already standing back up before the cowboy ever walked through the door. If that kind of courage moves you, subscribe. Stay with me until the very end and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The heat had been killing things for 3 weeks. First, the creek ran shallow. Then the grass went yellow and cracked underfoot, like old bone. Then one of Nell Whitaker's 2 remaining hens stopped laying and just sat in the corner of the coop, blinking at the sun with something that looked disturbingly close to surrender. Nell understood that feeling. She just didn't allow herself the luxury of it. That July morning started the same way every morning started, with Nell up before the light, hauling water from the well, mending what broke, feeding what was alive, and refusing to think about everything that wasn't. Thomas had been dead 14 months. The claim was still in her name, just barely. She hadn't cried in 6 of those months. Not because the grief was gone, because there was no time for it. Grief was a wound that needed sitting still to bleed out properly, and Nell Whitaker had not sat still once since the telegram came. She was in the middle of patching a section of fence line, hammer in one hand, a nail clenched between her teeth, when she heard them coming. 3 horses. Fast. No greeting call. That alone told her everything. Nell pulled the nail from between her teeth and turned slowly. Her Winchester was back at the cabin 40 yards away. Her heart did the math before her mind did. Too far. She walked toward the cabin anyway. Steady, not running. Running would tell them she was afraid. She was afraid. But she walked. The man who came through the gate first was wide in the shoulders and narrow in the eyes, with a jaw like a fence post, and hands that had done rough things so many times they'd stopped feeling it. He was Judd Pike, though Nell didn't know his name yet. She would learn it later, the same way you learn the name of a thing that hurt you after the fact, with teeth clenched. Behind him came Mason Vale, thin and quick-looking, with a grin that meant nothing. The kind of grin a dog wears before it bites. The third man, Tom Rusk, hung back near the gate, watching. "Mrs. Whitaker." Pike touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of manners. "We'd like a word." "Then use one," Nell said. She'd made it to the porch steps. 3 more feet to the door. "Word is your late husband left something behind that don't belong to you." Pike swung down from his horse without being invited. "Something our employer is very keen to recover." "My husband left me a deed and a headache," Nell said. "You're welcome to the headache. The deed stays." Pike smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. It never did, she'd learn. "We ain't talking about the deed, Mrs. Whitaker." She reached for the door. Pike moved faster than a man his size had any right to move. Chapter 4. What happened next lasted maybe 4 minutes. It felt like 40. She fought. That part mattered. She fought from the first second to the last one. When Pike grabbed her arm and yanked her back from the door, she drove her elbow into his jaw hard enough to make him spit. When Vale got hold of her wrist, she twisted and clawed for his face. She knocked a lamp off the table when they dragged her through the door. She grabbed the skillet hanging by the stove and connected it with the side of Vale's head before he ripped it away from her. She wasn't helpless. She was outnumbered. There's a difference, and it mattered to Nell more than anyone in that room understood. But 3 men to 1 woman in the middle of a July that had already stripped Montana territory down to its mean, ugly bones, it ended the way strength of numbers always ends. She hit the floor hard. Her vision split into white pieces and came back together slowly, like a mirror reassembling itself. The inside of her mouth tasted like pennies. Pike had her by the front of her shirt, hauling her half upright. "Where is it?" he said. "The satchel, the papers. We know Thomas had them. We know he didn't burn them because if he had, our employer would have heard about it. So where are they?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Nell said. Her voice was steady. She was furious about the blood and proud of the steady voice in equal measure. Pike hit her. She didn't give him the scream either. "Wrong answer," he said. Vale was going through the cabin now, pulling drawers, throwing her good dishes, tearing the mattress off the bed frame. He worked fast and without shame the way men worked when they'd been told the woman they were searching didn't matter. "You know what I think," Pike said, low and conversational, like they were discussing the weather. "I think a widow running a homestead alone in mining country has two choices. She cooperates or she becomes an inconvenience. You understand the difference between those two things, Mrs. Whitaker?" Nell looked at him. Directly, eye to eye. "I understand you're going to have to explain to your employer why you came back empty-handed," she said. He raised his hand again, and the door came off its hinges. The sound was enormous in the small cabin wood, cracking the iron latch, clanging against the floor. The sudden flood of white-hot summer light pouring through the frame like the outside world had decided to come in uninvited. Standing in that light was a man. Nell's first impression was not heroic. He was dusty, trail-worn, sunburned brown across the cheekbones in the way of men who spent more time under open sky than under any roof. His hat was battered to the point of being a personal affront to the concept of hats. His shirt faded blue, dark with sweat at the collar, was untucked on one side. He looked at the three men in her cabin. He looked at her on the floor. And his face did something very quiet and very dangerous. It went still. Not calm. Still. The way a mountain goes still before a rock slide. The way a river goes silent just before the dam breaks. He didn't say a word. Pike turned. "Who the hell?" The man moved. He was not a big man. Not compared to Pike. But he moved the way water moves around stone, finding angles, never wasting effort. He put the butt of his revolver across the side of Mason Vale's head before Vale could even straighten up from the drawer he was ransacking. Vale folded without a sound. Pike charged him. The man sidestepped, caught Pike's arm, and used his own momentum against him, brought his elbow down across the doorframe with a crack that made Tom Rusk, still outside at the gate, actually flinch. Pike screamed. His wrist had gone the wrong direction. Rusk grabbed for his rifle. The man already had his Colt out and leveled. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just pointed it at the space between Rusk's eyes with the steadiness of someone who had done this before and found no joy in it. "Ride," he said. One word. The quietest word Nell had ever heard spoken with that much iron behind it. Rusk rode. Pike was on his knees, cradling his wrist, face white and furious. The man pressed the Colt under the hinge of his jaw and said, still quiet, "Your friend's got a head injury. Your other friend's got a broken wrist. You ride now or I start on you. Ma'am's choice, not mine." Nell was already on her feet. She wasn't thinking. Her body moved before her mind issued the order 3 steps to the wall, where the shotgun hung up off the pegs and swung level. At the man in her doorway. The peg. He saw it happen. He turned slowly, both hands coming up, and he found himself looking down the double barrel of a 12-gauge, held by a woman with a split-lip fury in her eyes, and the absolutely correct instinct that a strange man who just broke her door down was not automatically better than the 3 strange men who'd already been there. "Ma'am," he said. His voice hadn't changed. Still quiet, still flat, like he was remarking on the weather. "Who are you?" Nell said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. "Caleb Ryder. Late of the Army, currently of no fixed attachment." He didn't lower his hands. "I'm going to assume you have good reason to point that at me because you clearly have good judgment." "I just got thrown across my own floor." "Yes, ma'am, I can see that. I'm sorry I was slow." Sorry he was slow, like he'd arrived at a scheduled appointment a few minutes late. "I don't know you," Nell said. "No, you don't. Those men work for Black Pine Mining. You one of theirs." "No." "Then what are you doing on my property?" He paused. A real pause. Not a salesman's pause, not a man gathering his lies, but something that looked like a man deciding exactly how much of the truth was going to help, and how much was going to make everything harder. I was sent by a man named Creedy, James Creedy. He was a courier out of Helena. He was dying when I found him on the North Fork Road, shot twice, one lung gone. He asked me to come here. He said, another pause. He said Thomas Whitaker hid something that needed to reach the territorial judge before Black Pine buried it along with everyone who knew about it. The cabin had gone very still. Behind Caleb, Pike had gotten to his feet and was inching toward the door, cradling his broken wrist. Stay, Caleb said without looking at him. Then to Nell, I came for a ledger, Mrs. Whitaker, but I reckon I found something considerably worse. Nell's arms didn't lower the shotgun, but something in her face changed, not softening, not relief, just the particular expression of a woman recalculating. How did you know Thomas? She said. I didn't. Creedy did. Thomas gave Creedy the information on where the ledger was hidden. Creedy was supposed to retrieve it himself and take it north. He didn't make it past the fork. What kind of information? The kind that puts names to murders, Caleb said. And crimes that weren't called crimes because the men who committed them had enough money to make the law look the other direction. The clock on the mantel cracked across the face, but still ticking, because Nell Whitaker did not throw away things that still worked, said 9:20. Outside, the Montana summer pressed against the windows like it was trying to get in. My husband died in a horse accident, Nell said. Her voice was careful and flat. Yes, ma'am. That's what they called it. The shotgun didn't lower, but her eyes changed. They went somewhere else for just a moment, somewhere Caleb had the sense not to follow. They called it an accident, she said again, quieter. I know. The sheriff wrote it up as an accident. The company paid for the funeral. Her jaw moved. They sent flowers. Mrs. Whitaker, they sent flowers to my door. The words came out between her teeth now, each one careful and controlled and electric, with something that had been sitting in her chest for 14 months without a name. Black ribbon on the arrangement, real lilies, and I thanked them. I stood there and I thanked them. Caleb said nothing, which was exactly right. Some things don't need commentary. She lowered the shotgun. Not because she trusted him, because what he'd said was true, and some part of her had known it was true since the morning she'd looked at Thomas's broken body, and the horse that wasn't spooked, and the road that wasn't dangerous, and added it up to a number that didn't make sense no matter how many times she ran the figures. You, she said to Pike, get out. Pike went. Nell waited until she heard hoofbeats fading into the heat. Then she sat down in the nearest chair, shotgun across her knees, and looked at the wreckage of her kitchen. What's in the ledger? She said. Hud. Caleb lowered his hands. He found the chair across the table without being invited, not presuming just practical, and sat like a man who'd been in the saddle since before dawn, which he had. According to Creedy, the ledger contains records going back 4 years. Names of company men who signed off on forced land purchases, forged deeds, a list of homesteads burned in the Southern Valley with dates. He paused. Names of people who were killed, made to look like accidents or blamed on Indians or just never investigated because nobody of consequence was interested. How many names? He met her eyes. 11 confirmed. Creedy thought there were more. Nell was quiet. Thomas's name is in there, Caleb said. As a target. There's a letter. Creedy had a copy from a Black Pine company manager to their enforcer, man named Silas Crow. It authorizes removal of the Whitaker impediment. Impediment. Nell tasted the word like something rotten. My husband was an impediment. He'd found the fraud. He was going to talk to the land commission. He talked to me, Nell said suddenly, the week before he died. He told me he'd found something in the survey records. Numbers that didn't match. She stopped. Her hands had gone very still on the shotgun barrel. I told him to be careful. I told him to wait, that we had enough trouble without borrowing more. She looked at the wall. He said he couldn't in good conscience let it go. Caleb said nothing. He recognized the particular shape of that silence, the kind that belongs to people going back through every last thing they said to someone who wasn't there anymore. Where's the ledger? she said finally. That's the problem. Creedy gave me a location, said Thomas told him, but it's not in the cabin. His exact words were, near the claim but above it. Then he died before he could say more. Above the claim. Nell frowned. There's nothing above the claim except the summer cattle line. The old grazing pasture up by Widow's Pass. Thomas used to go up there before the herd got too small to bother. He go alone. Always. She looked up. He said he did his best thinking up there. I thought he just needed time away from the difficulty of things. Maybe, Caleb said. Maybe not. The room between them was full of things that hadn't been named yet. Nell stood abruptly crossed to the water basin and began cleaning the blood off her face with the economy of a woman who had treated her own injuries before and expected to do it again. She used cold water and a piece of clean cloth, and she was methodical about it, and she did not look at him. You want the ledger, she said. Yes. To take to the judge in Helena? Yes. And if you get it there, what happens to Blackpine? Depends on how honest the judge is, Caleb said. If he's straight and Creedy believed he was, which is why he was trying to get there, then there's an investigation. Federal, maybe. The land crimes get documented. The men named in the ledger face charges. He paused. No guarantee of convictions. Never is with money on the other side. But the silence breaks. And once silence breaks, it's harder to put back. And Silas Crow. There was something in the way she said that name. Not like she'd heard it for the first time today. Like she'd been carrying it. Caleb looked at her carefully. You know him. He came to this claim 3 months after Thomas died, Nell said. She was still facing the basin, still not looking at Caleb. Very polite, very clean. Nice suit for a man riding mountain roads. He said Blackpine wanted to offer me a fair price for the claim. Said a widow alone couldn't manage it, and they could give me enough to start somewhere easier. She set down the cloth. When I said no, he said I might find the claim harder than I expected. Her voice didn't shake. I told him I'd already found the hardest thing in the world and survived it, and that he should ride back the way he came. What did he do? He tipped his hat. She finally turned around. And he smiled. And he said, I do admire a woman with spirit, Mrs. Whitaker. For now. For now. Caleb felt something cold settle in the back of his mind. The kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. When did his men come back? He said. This morning was the third time. Third time. She'd fought them off twice already, alone. He thought about the fence he'd noticed on the way in, mended in 3 different places, with 3 different kinds of wire, each one tight and functional. He thought about the way she'd gotten to her feet while her vision was still reassembling itself. He thought about the nail between her teeth. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, Crow is going to come back. Not his men, Crow himself, when they report this morning. I know. He's not going to be polite this time. I know that too. Then you know you can't hold this alone. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were the kind of gray that changes color depending on the light. Dark now, almost slate the way the sky went before weather came in. Mr. Ryder, she said. I have been holding this alone for 14 months. I've held it through 2 visits from Crow's men, and 1 fire in my hay barn that they meant to look accidental and didn't quite manage. I held it through a winter that froze my water line, and a spring flood that took part of my fence, and a summer that's trying its level best to dry everything I own into dust. She picked up the shotgun and set it carefully on its pegs on the wall. I am not looking for someone to hold it for me. I am looking for someone who can help me hold it long enough to finish this. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what I'm offering. She studied him. The sunburn, the worn hat, the way he held his hands loose, patient, but never entirely still, the hands of a man who'd spent years needing to be ready. You sleep outside, she said. Already planned on it. You don't come inside unless invited. Yes, ma'am. And you tell me everything, not pieces, everything. She held his gaze. My husband died keeping secrets to protect me. I won't make that trade again. Caleb Ryder nodded once. "Everything," he said. "You have my word." Outside, the Montana sun climbed higher, turning the yard into a mirror of white light. Somewhere down the mountain, Judd Pike and Tom Rusk were riding hard toward a man in a nice suit who was going to want answers. And in a rusted coffee tin buried beneath a stone at Widow's Pass, higher up than Nell had thought to look, in a place her husband had gone alone to think, a leather ledger sat in the dark waiting. It had been waiting 14 months. It could wait a little longer. But not much. He fixed the door first. Nell hadn't asked him to. She'd gone to the well to wash her face properly, and when she came back, Caleb Ryder was on one knee in the doorframe, with a hammer she hadn't seen him bring in, tapping the hinge pin back into alignment with the patient. Careful strikes of someone who understood that things worth keeping required patience. He didn't look up when she came back. She didn't thank him. That was how the first day went. She made coffee because she would have made it anyway, and she left a cup on the porch rail without saying anything. And when she came back an hour later, it was gone, and he was mending the stretch of fence Pike's horses had torn through when they charged in. He'd found her wire and her pliers without asking. He used the same kind of hitch Thomas used to use. She noticed that against her will, the way you notice things that cost you something to see. By nightfall, Caleb had the door rehung, the fence mended, her water trough patched where it had been leaking since May, and her mule ornery half-blind Henry, who had bitten 2 different men in the past year, eating grain out of his hand like they were old acquaintances. She stood in the doorway watching that and said, "Henry doesn't like men." "Most sensible animal I've met today," Caleb said. She almost smiled. She caught it before it got out. "You're sleeping outside," she reminded him. "Already made my bed," he said. "Porch suits me fine." It was 100 degrees at dusk. The porch faced west and caught the last of the heat like a brick wall. Nell lay awake inside listening to the night sounds, and at some point she realized she was listening for his breathing too. Steady, slow. He slept like a man with a clean conscience or very good discipline, and she couldn't yet tell which. She didn't sleep much herself. Morning came with the sound of Caleb already moving. By the 3rd day they had a kind of unspoken system. She cooked. He didn't comment on the food. He worked. She didn't comment on the work. They spoke in sentences that were short and functional and gave away nothing extra, and it was not comfortable exactly but structured. Like 2 people who had decided to be in the same place without yet deciding what that meant. "You were Army," she said one evening. She was at the table with Thomas's old survey notes spread out. Caleb was on the porch cleaning his revolver. 7 years, he said. Through the open window, she could see the side of his face. Scouts. High country mostly. You leave or they let you go. A pause. Not evasion consideration. Little of both, he said. There was an incident up in the Judith Basin. A cavalry captain decided a Crow encampment was a military target. It wasn't. I said so. He didn't appreciate the disagreement. And I had a choice between my rank and my conscience, and my conscience has always been the louder of the two. He ran the cleaning rod through the barrel. I left, spent 2 years doing nothing useful. Then Creedy found me. James Creedy was your friend. He was a decent man, Caleb said, which is rarer than it ought to be. Nell looked down at the survey notes. Thomas's handwriting, neat, precise. The handwriting of a man who took measurements seriously. Numbers and boundary lines and notes in the margins that she'd always thought were just the ordinary language of surveying. She was beginning to think they were something else entirely. Come look at this, she said. He set down the revolver. He came to the door, stopped at the threshold, waited. She realized he was doing it deliberately, waiting to be asked inside. She'd told him not to come in uninvited, and he hadn't not once, not even when it was convenient. Come in, she said. It's your side of the work. He sat across the table, and she turned the survey notes toward him. Thomas marked the eastern boundary lines twice. The second marking is in a different color ink. I thought he made an error and corrected it, but... She pointed. The second set of numbers doesn't match the first. It's not a correction. It's a different boundary. Caleb leaned over the notes. His eyes moved fast, she noticed that. Whatever he'd done in 7 years of scouting, it had trained him to read information quickly. "These numbers here," he said, tapping a column in the margin. "These aren't boundary measurements." "What are they?" "Distances and directions." He looked up. "Someone has been mapping your property. These marks show approach routes, where to enter without being seen from the cabin, where a horse could pass without leaving obvious track." His voice went very flat. "These notes aren't Thomas's survey records, Mrs. Whitaker. They're Thomas's documentation of being watched." The room went absolutely quiet. "He knew," Nell said. "He knew they were scouting him. He was keeping record." Caleb turned the page. "How long ago did he start these notes?" Nell's throat was tight. "The date on the first page, that's 8 months before he died." 8 months. He'd known for 8 months that someone was mapping his land, measuring his movements, plotting approach routes like they were military objectives. And he'd come home every evening and eaten supper and fixed what broke and said, "Be careful, Nell. Don't borrow trouble," while he was secretly building evidence that men were planning to take everything they had. "He was protecting you," Caleb said quietly. "He didn't want you to know how dangerous it was. He should have told me." The words came out harsher than she intended. We could have done something sooner. We could have left. We could have." She stopped. "He didn't think they'd move against him directly," Caleb said. "That's my guess. Men like Crow usually use pressure first. Legal maneuvers, fake debt, forged documents. Physical violence is a last resort because it makes noise." He paused. Thomas must have found something that changed the calculation. Something that made him too dangerous to just pressure. "The ledger," Nell said. "Whatever he put in it." She sat back. The lamp between them threw their shadows long against the wall. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere in the dark hills, once, then silence. "He kept going up to the summer line," she said softly. "Even in the weeks before he died. I asked him why. He said the air was cleaner up there." She looked at her hands. "He was hiding the evidence. He was building the case. And I was complaining about the fence line and asking him to fix the water trough, and I had no idea he was—" "Mrs. Whitaker." "Nell." She said it sharp, like correcting a mistake. "My name is Nell. If we're going to do this together, use my name." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Nell." He said it carefully, like he was making sure he had it right. "What Thomas did wasn't a secret he kept against you. It was a secret he kept for you. There's a difference." "Maybe." She gathered the survey notes and set them in a neat stack. "Doesn't make the not knowing hurt less." He didn't argue with that. He just nodded once and stood and went back to the porch, and she heard him settle, and the night went quiet around them again. She sat at the table a long time after that, not looking at anything in particular, before she finally went to bed. 4 days in, she let him teach her to shoot. Not from lack of skill, she could handle a shotgun well enough at close range, and she'd told him so. But Caleb had watched the terrain with the eye of a man who thought in distances, and what he said made hard sense. "Crow won't send his men close again," he said. "Not after the last time. Next approach will be from the tree line. 200 yards, maybe more. Your shotgun is a 15-yard weapon." She hated that he was right. He set up a series of tin cans on the fence posts at the far end of the property, one at 50 yards, one at 101 just past the edge where it was harder to judge. He handed her the Winchester and stood back. She missed the first shot by 3 feet. He said nothing. She missed the second by 1 foot. Still nothing. "You could coach me," she said, not looking at him. "I could," he agreed. "But you're correcting yourself already. You adjust better without my voice in your ear." She shot the third one. Dead center. The satisfaction of it moved through her like something physical, warm and fierce and startling. She hadn't felt that in a long time. The clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of something difficult done right. "Again," she said. They were out there 2 hours. By the end, she was hitting the 100-yard mark 4 out of 5 tries, and Caleb was leaning against the fence rail with his arms crossed and something on his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough to recognize. "Don't look pleased," she told him, reloading. "I'm not pleased," he said. "I'm relieved. There's a difference." She hit the last can so clean it spun off the post and disappeared into the grass. Neither of them said anything, but she let herself feel it this time instead of catching it before it got out. That evening she set 2 plates at the table. He noticed. He didn't make a thing of it. He sat down and ate and complimented the biscuits, and she told him they were nothing special, which wasn't entirely true. The fence post symbols turned up the next morning. Nell had sent Caleb to check the east line while she worked the west. They'd divided it up after a brief practical discussion that had the quality of a business arrangement more than anything else. She heard him whistle short, sharp a signal they'd agreed on for "Come here, I found something." She rode over. He was crouched at the 3rd post from the corner, running his thumb over a mark carved into the wood at knee height. She dismounted and looked. It was a small symbol, a circle with a line through it like a compass mark. Not damage, not accident. Cut deliberately with a knife. "Thomas," she said immediately. "Most likely. There's another one 6 posts down." Caleb stood, moved along the fence line. She followed. The 2nd post had the same mark, but with an additional notch on the right side of the line. The 3rd, 50 yards further, had 2 notches. "He was marking a route," Caleb said, "starting here and going." He oriented himself, then pointed north. That direction. North was toward the high country, toward the summer line, toward Widow's Pass. "He was leaving a trail," Nell said. "In case—" She stopped. "In case someone else had to follow it," Caleb said. "In case he wasn't there to lead them." She put her hand on the fence post. The wood was dry and rough and hot from the sun, and somewhere under Thomas's carved mark there were 14 months of weather, and she still couldn't touch something he'd touched without it costing her something. "How many posts are marked?" she said. "I'll need to walk the full line, but if they go all the way to the north boundary—" Caleb did the calculation in his head. He was careful. He was systematic. This isn't a man who was afraid. This is a man who was prepared. She straightened up. "We follow the marks." "Not yet." He said it carefully, watching her face. "Crow's men know something is on this property. They came looking. If we ride for the pass now and they're watching, then we need to know if they're watching," she said. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You're thinking like a scout." "I'm thinking like a woman who's already lost 1 person to these men," she said. "I'm not inclined to hand them a second." Walt. The preacher came on the 6th day. He arrived on a swayback mare dressed in black that had faded to a dusty gray, with a Bible in his saddlebag, and the particular expression of a man who carried bad news for a living and had made his peace with it. His name was Aldous Peel. He'd been riding circuit through the mountain valleys for 11 years, and he knew every homestead, every family, every grave marker from the Fork to the High Pass. Nell knew him from 2 funerals and 1 bad winter when he'd brought food from the church collection to isolated claims when the road was impassable. She trusted him as much as she trusted anyone, which meant cautiously. He dismounted and looked at Caleb on the porch, the way he'd look at unexpected weather, noting it adjusting. "Mrs. Whitaker, I hope I'm not intruding." "You never intrude, Aldous," she said. "Coffee." "Wouldn't refuse it." They sat on the porch. Caleb stood. Nell noticed the preacher's eyes going to Caleb's gun belt, then to his face, then settling somewhere in between with the expression of a man running a private calculation. "I come with a purpose," Peel said. "Had 2 riders stop me on the North Fork Road yesterday morning. Black Pine men I've seen their type enough to know. They asked if I'd been through this valley, and had I seen anyone new at the Whitaker claim." He looked at Nell steadily. "I told them I hadn't been through in 3 weeks, which was technically true. But I pushed my schedule up when I heard Silas Crow was back from Virginia City." The name landed in the air between them. Caleb went very still. "Back," Nell said. Rode into Coldwater Springs 2 days ago, checked into the hotel. He's not alone, brought at least 4 men with him. Strangers, not the usual hands. Peel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Nell, whatever is happening on this claim, whatever those men came looking for before, I believe Crow intends to settle it himself this time. How long do we have? Caleb said. Peel looked at him directly for the first time. And you are someone who is going to make sure Mrs. Whitaker is still alive by the time Crow gets here, Caleb said. How long? Peel considered whether to be offended by the tone, decided against it. 2 days, 3 at most. He's gathering information in town first. He'll want to know exactly what he's riding into before he comes. Nell put her cup down on the rail, very deliberately, very steadily. 2 days. Aldous, she said. If something happens here, if we don't make it to Helena with what we're carrying, will you remember this conversation publicly? The old preacher looked at her a long time. He had buried her husband. He had spoken at that graveside in a wind so cold it stole the words before anyone could hear them. He had watched Nell Whitaker stand with her hands folded and her face perfectly composed and her eyes completely dry in the way that meant she was somewhere else entirely, somewhere too far down in grief for tears to reach. I will remember every word, he said. He left an hour later, riding slowly back toward the road. Caleb watched him go, and Nell watched Caleb watch him, and she was cataloging the lines of his face the way she'd learned to catalog weather, looking for what was coming. We go tomorrow, she said. We need one more thing first, he said. Any papers Thomas left? Letters, notes, anything you haven't looked at since? He stopped. It's possible he left a clearer location. Peel just cut our window in half. She went inside. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said from inside in a voice that had changed register in a way Caleb couldn't quite name Caleb. He came to the door, waited. Come in, she said. She was on her knees by the north wall near the corner where the floorboard had always been slightly wrong, slightly higher than its neighbors, slightly reluctant when you stepped on it. She'd assumed it was just bad carpentry. Thomas had always meant to fix it. He hadn't fixed it because he'd cut it himself. The board came up with a short flat tool. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a length of leather cord, was a packet of papers. On top of them, in Thomas's careful handwriting, was a single sealed envelope. For Nell. If I don't come home. She sat on her heels and stared at it. Caleb stood in the doorway, not moving, not speaking, giving her the space that the moment demanded. He prepared this, she said. Her voice was very controlled. He prepared this before he died. He put it here, and every morning he got up and he had coffee with me, and he told me about the fence line, and he kissed me before he went out, and he... She stopped. He already knew. She picked up the envelope. Her hands were steady. She broke the seal. The letter was 3 pages. Thomas Whitaker's handwriting, small and precise, every line level without a ruled guide, because he had always had that gift, the ability to keep a line straight when everything around it was tilted. She read it alone. Caleb stayed in the doorway. He heard her breathing change twice. He heard the paper turn. He heard one long, unsteady exhale about 2/3 of the way through, the kind that lives just below a sound you've decided not to make. When she finished, she sat still for a moment. Then she stood up, folded the letter with care, and held it against her chest for exactly 3 seconds. Just 3. Like allowing herself that much and no more. Then she looked at Caleb. He knew, she said. He says in the letter he says he believed they would try to stop him. He says he put the ledger at the summer line inside the old cattle shelter under the hearthstone. He says... She took a breath. He says if I'm reading this, then I already know something went wrong. And he's sorry, and he needs me to do one more hard thing. He needs me to get the ledger to someone who can use it. Caleb said nothing. He waited. He says... Her voice caught. Not broke. Caught. She kept going. You are the bravest person I have known, Eleanor, and I have kept things from you to protect you, which I understand now was wrong. Not because you couldn't have handled the truth, because you deserve to be the one to decide what to do with it. That was yours to choose, not mine to manage. Forgive me for the managing." The silence after that was the kind that has weight. "He called me Eleanor when he was being serious," she said. Caleb looked at the floor, then back at her. "He was right about you," he said simply. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't be kind about it right now. I need to be angry for another few minutes before I can be anything else." He nodded. He understood that. Some grief comes out sideways as fury before it can come out any other way. He'd learned that about himself a long time ago, in a field outside Bozeman, standing next to a grave that shouldn't have been there. She stood in the middle of her cabin holding her dead husband's letter, and she breathed, and Caleb Ryder stood in her doorway and kept watch without being asked, and the afternoon pressed against the windows, and Silas Crow was in a hotel room 30 miles south, getting information about exactly where she was and exactly what she had. 2 days, maybe less. After a while, Nell folded the letter and tucked it into her shirt pocket, close to her chest. She looked at Caleb, and her eyes were dry, and her jaw was set, and every line of her said she was done with the grieving portion of the program, at least for now, at least for long enough to do what needed doing. "Widows pass," she said. "We leave before dawn." "Agreed. I ride my own horse." "Wouldn't have it any other way." "And Caleb." She held his eyes. "Whatever happens up there, that ledger gets to Helena. Even if I can't make it. Even if it's just you. You promise me that." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through the weight of the request, not the promise itself, but what it meant that she'd asked it. What it meant that she'd put the mission above herself. Thomas Whitaker had married the right woman. He just hadn't had the sense to tell her everything. "I promise," Caleb said. She nodded once like a contract signed. Then she went to the stove to start supper because they needed to eat and sleep and be strong for the morning, and Eleanor Whitaker had never once in her life allowed grief to get between her and what needed doing next. Outside, somewhere in the tree line to the east, something moved. Caleb's eyes went there immediately, the automatic tracking of a man trained to notice motion at the edge of vision. A horse, just visible in the trees, standing still. Someone was watching the cabin. He didn't move. He didn't call out. He stood in the doorway and noted the position and the angle and the direction of the fading light, and he calculated and he let his face stay calm. Then he stepped back inside and said very quietly, "Don't go to the windows tonight." Nell turned from the stove. She looked at him. She read his face. "How many?" she said. "One that I can see." Crow's men came early. One of them did. He paused. "They're counting us, counting horses, deciding what to report." Her jaw tightened. "Then we make tonight look ordinary." "Yes. And we leave before they can report back." "Before first light," he said. She turned back to the stove. Her hands didn't shake. She stirred the pot and added salt and said, "You'd better eat well then. It's a hard ride to the pass." Outside, the single rider in the trees watched the cabin windows glow with lamplight and saw nothing unusual. Just a woman cooking supper. Just the shadow of a man moving behind glass. Just an ordinary evening at an ordinary homestead in the mountains. That was exactly what Nell Whitaker intended for them to see. She was done being underestimated. Tomorrow she was going to finish what Thomas started. Here. End of part 2. They left at 3 in the morning, when the dark was still absolute and the watcher in the tree line was gone. That last part bothered Caleb more than if the man had still been there. A scout who leaves his post either got what he needed or got his orders changed. Either way, someone now knew they were still at the cabin, still had horses, and would know by dawn that those horses were gone. He didn't tell Nell this. She already knew. He could see it in the way she saddled her mare without a lamp by feel and memory fast and silent, and how she tied Thomas's letter inside her coat before she mounted. Some things you say out loud, and some things you just both understand and move on. They rode north without speaking. The trail climbed steadily. The air cooled as they gained elevation, which was a mercy. By the time the first gray light began to separate the ridgeline from the sky, they were well above the valley floor, and Nell's cabin was a small dark shape 1,000 feet below them. Caleb rode behind and to the left, watching their back trail. "You've been checking behind us since we left," Nell said. "Yes." "How far back?" "Don't know yet. Maybe nothing." He paused. "Probably not nothing." She didn't slow down. She pressed her mare slightly faster and Caleb matched her, and they rode hard into what was left of the dark. An hour in, he spotted the rider. Not directly behind them, off to the east, higher on the ridge, moving parallel. Just one. Keeping pace, but not closing distance. Watching. "Nell," he said quietly. "Don't look right. Keep riding." "How many?" "One visible, which means at least two." Her hands tightened on the reins. Her mare felt it and tossed her head once. Nell absorbed it and kept her voice even. "They're hurting us." "That's what I'd do," he said. "So we stop?" "No, we move faster." He pulled up alongside her. "If they wanted to take us on the trail, they'd have done it already. Crow wants the ledger, and he wants to know where it is first. They'll let us find it for them." She looked at him directly, and he saw it not fear, not hesitation, but the particular look of a person recalculating in real time, running new information through every decision they'd already made. "Then we make sure we find it before they can take it," she said. "That's the whole game," he said. She kicked her mare into a gallop, and he followed, and behind them the single rider on the ridge stopped, then turned and rode east fast, purposeful toward something or someone waiting. Chapter. The old cattle shelter sat at the far end of the summer grazing line above the tree limit, backed against the stone face of the pass itself. Thomas had built it 7 years ago with salvaged lumber and riverstone, and the kind of stubborn determination that characterized everything the man had apparently done, including hiding evidence of murder in it. The shelter was small and weathered, and the door had come half off its hinges. Inside there was nothing left of the cattle years, just a crumbling stone hearth, a broken stool, and the smell of seasons passing through an empty place. Nell went straight to the hearth. The hearthstone was flat and large, and had been laid without mortar. Intentional, Caleb saw now, deliberately left able to be moved. He helped her lift it. Not because she needed him to, but because it was heavy, and they didn't have time. Beneath it, wrapped in the same kind of oilcloth as Thomas's letter, was a leather ledger the size of a large Bible. Nell picked it up and held it with both hands, and she didn't open it immediately. She just held it the way you hold something you've come a long way to reach, taking 1 second to acknowledge the weight of it before you decide what to do next. "Is this it?" Caleb said. She turned it over. On the back cover in Thomas's handwriting, 2 words for Helena. "This is it," she said. "This is it." She was already moving toward the door when Caleb caught her arm. He'd heard it half a second before she saw it, the sound of multiple horses stopping, the particular silence that follows when riders pull up and dismount and spread out, the sound of a trap closing. He put his finger to his lips. She froze. They stood inside the shelter, listening to the sounds outside rearrange themselves, and Caleb counted positions by ear, the way he'd learned to do in 7 years of high country, 4, maybe 5 men spreading to cover exits that weren't exits. Taking the high ground, boxing them in. "Back door," Nell whispered. "There isn't one." "There will be," she said, and she crossed to the rear wall and hit the weakest point of it, the corner where the old lumber had separated from the stone, with her shoulder once hard. It gave 8 inches. Not enough. Caleb hit it with his boot, and it gave a foot. Outside, someone called, "Mrs. Whitaker, Mr. Ryder. I think we've arrived at the same place at the same time. That seems like Providence, don't you think?" The voice was pleasant, unhurried. The voice of a man who had no reason to be in a hurry because he already controlled the outcome. Silas Crow. Caleb looked at the gap in the wall, too narrow for him, barely passable for Nell. He looked at Nell. She was already looking at him. She'd done the same calculation. "Give me the ledger," he said quietly. She pulled it against her chest. No. Nell, if they take me, you still have it. If they take you... She stopped, looked at the gap, back at him. You're not going to fit through that. That's correct. So I take the ledger out the back while I have a conversation with Mr. Crow, he said. She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. The look of someone who knows what the words mean underneath the words that are being spoken. Don't you get shot? She said. I'll do my best. She took the ledger and went through the gap sideways fast and low and disappeared into the rocks, and Caleb pulled the gap shut as much as it would go and turned to face the door. He walked out with his hands visible, but not raised the posture of a man who has made a decision and is comfortable with it. There were 6 of them. Crow had counted correctly when he said he'd brought strangers. These weren't Pike and Vale, who Caleb knew by face. These were hired men, the kind you find in mining towns, and rough countrymen who do the work without asking the reasons. They were positioned well. Someone had briefed them on Caleb's capabilities because no one was standing where he could reach them quickly. Silas Crow stood in front of them all. He was everything Nell had said and more. Clean suit improbable in this terrain. Hat without a mark of trail dust, which meant a very good horse or a very short ride from where his men had been waiting. A face that was almost handsome and entirely false. The kind of face that learned to perform warmth so long ago it had forgotten what warmth actually felt like. He looked at Caleb with the expression of a man examining a minor obstacle. Mr. Ryder, he said. James Creedy's errand boy. I know about you. Creedy talked before he died. Caleb said nothing. You've been at the Whitaker claim for 6 days, Crow continued. That's longer than I expected. Mrs. Whitaker must be more persuasive than she appears. He glanced at the shelter. Where is she? Gone, Caleb said. With the ledger. With her husband's property, Caleb said. Which is what it is, Crow smiled. It was like watching a door close. It's evidence that certain business transactions were not conducted in the most transparent manner. Nothing more. It's a list of people you had killed, Caleb said, including Thomas Whitaker. Something changed in Crow's face. Not guilt, not even acknowledgement of guilt. Something almost like impatience. The impatience of a man who has been made to discuss a detail he considers beneath the level of discussion. Thomas Whitaker made himself a problem, Crow said. Problems get solved. That's the nature of business. He tilted his head. You were Army. You understand how things work. Sometimes people are in the wrong place, and the decision is made above your pay grade, and you just execute the order. I left the Army because I stopped executing orders that murdered people, Caleb said. So no, I don't understand. Crow sighed. Actually sighed like a man whose patience with the conversation had worn through. Mr. Ryder, you're 1 man. I have 6. The ledger is with a woman alone in the rocks, and my men have been above this pass since last night. He let that settle. Tell me where she went, and this ends cleanly. Caleb said nothing. I can offer you money, Crow said. Real money, enough to disappear. I don't want to disappear, Caleb said. Then I can offer you something less pleasant. Crow nodded to the man on his left. The first shot came from above. Caleb moved before the sound fully registered left and down behind the corner of the shelter, drawing as he moved. The bullet hit the doorframe where he'd been standing. The second shot caught him. It went through the left side below the ribs. Not a killing shot, it missed the vital places by a margin that was either God's mercy or the shooter's incompetence. But it knocked him sideways and lit every nerve in his torso on fire, and for 3 full seconds, his vision went white and useless. He came back into himself against the stone wall of the shelter, one hand pressed to his side, the other still holding the Colt. He could hear the men repositioning. Crow's voice giving orders, calm, unhurried, like a man directing livestock. Get above the rocks. Find the woman. Leave the man. Leave the man. Meaning Caleb was no longer the priority. Meaning Nell was. He pushed off the wall and moved because staying still was dying, and dying wasn't acceptable. He came around the corner of the shelter at an angle they weren't expecting, and put 2 shots in front of the nearest man, not at him in front, close enough to make the horse rear, and the man fight for control and buy 30 seconds of chaos. 30 seconds was enough. He went for the high ground on the west side, the only direction nobody was covering because they'd all gone east after Nell. He was bleeding, and the climb cost him, but he made it, and from the top he could see the whole spread of the pass. He could see Nell. She was in the rocks 30 yards east pinned. 2 of Crow's men had cut her off from the horses. She had the ledger in one hand and her revolver in the other, Caleb's spare, which she'd taken without telling him, and which he'd noticed and said nothing about, and she was pressed into a crack in the rock face that barely covered her. Judd Pike was moving toward her from the left. Pike's broken wrist was splinted and wrapped, and he was moving with the particular purpose of a man who has a specific grievance to settle. Nell didn't see him. She was watching the 2 men in front of her. Caleb couldn't get the angle. The distance was wrong, and he was bleeding, and his hands weren't entirely steady, and if he missed the bullet, went toward Nell. He didn't have the shot. Nell heard the footstep a half-second too late. Pike came around the rock fast and got his good hand on the arm with the revolver and wrenched it sideways, and she fought him the same way she'd fought in the cabin, without hesitation, without calculation, just pure refusal. But Pike was big and furious, and today he only needed one working hand to overpower her. He slammed her back into the rock face and got his forearm across her collarbone and leaned his full weight into it, and she felt the stone at her back and the pain in her shoulder and the revolver skittering across the rock somewhere she couldn't reach. The ledger was still in her left hand. Her fingers locked around it by instinct. "Let it go," Pike said. His face was 3 inches from hers. "Let it go, and I carry you back to Crow, and maybe he's generous today." She looked him in the eyes. "Let it go," he said again, and there was something in his voice now that went past professional, something personal. The accumulated anger of a man who'd been made to feel incompetent by a widow and a drifter and a handful of days, and didn't know what to do with that, except press harder. She didn't let go. He raised his good hand. The shot came from above and to the left, and it was perfectly placed, not at Pike, past him, close enough to blow chips off the rock an inch from his ear. Close enough to make him flinch back by pure reflex, which was all Nell needed. She drove her knee up, twisted sideways, and came out of the space between him and the rock, and ran. She didn't look up to find Caleb. She didn't have to. She ran toward the horses, toward cover, toward the one place she knew she needed to be. But Pike recovered faster than she expected, and he caught her by the back of her coat and spun her, and she went down hard on one knee on the shale, and the ledger flew from her hand. It hit the ground and slid 6 feet and stopped at the toe of Silas Crow's boot. He looked down at it, then up at Nell on her knee on the rock, catching her breath. He crouched and picked it up with a kind of deliberateness that made it a statement. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "your husband was a man of principle. That's what killed him." He opened the ledger and glanced at the first page with the expression of a man checking a household account. "Principle is a luxury. You can't eat it. It doesn't keep the wolves out. It doesn't save anyone." He closed the ledger. "You can go home," he said. "What's left of the home. Sign the deed transfer, and I'll leave you enough to get somewhere easier. Somewhere where widows don't have to fight for things they can't keep." Nell got to her feet. Her knee was bleeding through her trousers. Her shoulder was screaming. Her hair had come loose on one side, and she didn't fix it. She stood up straight on the broken shale of Widow's Pass with nothing in her hands and looked at Silas Crow. "My husband didn't die for principle," she said. Her voice was steady and hard and completely clear. "He died because men like you don't know any other way to do business. You can't buy something, you break it. You can't argue someone down, you bury them." Her chin came up. "You sent men to burn out families. You forged deeds on land people built with their hands. You had my husband killed, and then you sent flowers to my door with a black ribbon on them." Crow watched her with something like academic interest. "And you think delivering that ledger changes anything," he said. "I think it starts something," she said, "which is all anything ever does." He shook his head, the slow, patient headshake of a man who has made peace with being the villain in someone else's story, because he knows the villain usually wins. He tucked the ledger under his arm. "Widows don't change the world, Mrs. Whitaker," he said. She looked at him. "No," she said. "But we remember where the bodies are buried." Something shifted in his expression. Just slightly. Just for a second. The first real thing she'd seen on his face, not calculation, not performance. Something colder and more instinctive. He turned to go. She was already moving. What happened next? Caleb saw from above, bleeding into his shirt, half braced against a rock that was the only reason he was still standing. He saw it clearly enough to understand it, and never entirely enough to explain it, the particular kind of decision that doesn't come from strategy, that comes from somewhere below thought, from the place where people keep the things they refuse to give up. Nell ran past Pike before he could get hold of her again. She ran past the two men in front who were watching Crow, and not her, because in their calculation, she was already finished. She ran to the rope bridge. The rope bridge was old, built by miners years ago, to cross the gap in the pass, a narrow 30-foot crossing over a drop that was not lethal if you fell correctly, and was certainly lethal if you didn't. Crow had sent one man across it, the man with the rifle, who had shot Caleb, and now he was recrossing to regroup. Crow was 20 feet behind Nell and walking fast. She reached the bridge before him. She didn't cross it. She turned sideways, braced her feet, and grabbed the main support rope, the anchor line thick as her wrist, knotted around an iron spike driven into the rock. She looked at Crow. He stopped walking. For the first time since she'd seen his name at the bottom of a polite letter offering to buy her dead husband's land, he stopped being certain. "Step back," she said, "or I pull this anchor." The man already halfway across the bridge heard that and froze. Beneath him, 30 feet of nothing. "You'll bring the whole thing down," Crow said, "with my man on it." "Tell your man to get off it," she said. "Nell," Caleb's voice came from above, rough with pain. "The ledger." She looked at Crow's arm, the ledger tucked close. Crow looked at the rope in her hands, at the iron spike, at the 30 feet below his man on the bridge. "You won't," he said. "Give me the ledger," she said. "You won't bring that bridge down with—" She pulled the anchor. Not all the way, not the final pull, not yet. Just enough to make the bridge shift and groan and the boards drop 2 inches on the far side, and the man on it grab the rope handrails with both hands and make a sound that was not professional or composed. "Next one's final," Nell said. Crow looked at her hands, at the spike, at his man, at the ledger under his arm. He was doing what all men like him did when backed into a real corner, calculating whether the thing in his arms was worth what it was about to cost him. The ledger was evidence. Without it, there was still a witness ledger that Creedy might have copied, still the possibility of Caleb getting to Helena, still all the variables that couldn't be controlled from a rope bridge over a 30-foot drop. He threw the ledger. She caught it left-handed, without letting go of the anchor rope with her right. Then he ran back toward his remaining men, shouting orders, reorganizing, pivoting to the exit, the way a professional always pivoted when one plan failed, already building the next. Nell released the anchor rope and turned toward the slope where Caleb had last spoken from. "Caleb. Here." His voice was lower now, more effort in it. She found him on the backside of the rock, sitting with his back against the stone, and his hand pressed to his left side, dark with blood. Not gushing. Seeping steadily in the way that meant time was not infinite, but was not gone yet. She knelt beside him and pulled his hand away to look, and his jaw clenched, but he let her. "How bad?" she said. "I've had worse," he said. "That is not an answer." "It missed everything vital, I think." He looked at her. "You got it." She held up the ledger. Something in his face went quiet and relieved in a way that had nothing to do with the wound. Thomas would be— "Don't," she said the same way she'd said it in the cabin when he'd tried to be kind. But this time, there was something different underneath it. Not rejection. More like she was saving the feeling for later, for a moment when she could hold it without it taking her apart. She tore a section from the cleanest part of her underskirt and pressed it to his side, and held it there firm and steady while she looked over the rocks toward where Crow had gone. "He'll regroup," Caleb said. "I know. He has to. He can't let us reach Helena." "I know that too." "Then we need to move," he said. "Right now before he repositions." She looked at him, at the blood soaking through the makeshift bandage, at the lines around his mouth that hadn't been there a week ago. "Can you ride?" she said. He pushed himself upright against the rock, and the sound he made was quiet and controlled, and told her everything she needed to know about how much it cost him. "Watch me," he said. She stood. She tucked the ledger inside her coat, against her chest, the same place she kept Thomas's letter. The two things her husband had left her. The truth and the instructions for what to do with it. Behind them, Crow's voice drifted up from the lower rocks, still calm, still giving orders. A man who had been outmaneuvered, but not beaten. Not yet. "How far to the horses?" Caleb said. 50 yards. "Then let's cover it." She put her shoulder under his left arm and took part of his weight, and he let her, and they moved together across the rocks toward the horses. And the summer morning broke wide open over Widow's Pass in that particular Montana way, sharp light thin air. The whole world lit up clean and merciless and honest. She didn't look back at the bridge. She didn't need to. Crow was still in the rocks below, still breathing, still calculating. But the ledger was with Eleanor Whitaker, and she was moving, and she had learned something in the last 6 days that she hadn't known she'd forgotten. She had learned that she did not have to do hard things alone in order to prove she could do hard things. Caleb's breath came in short, controlled measures against her shoulder as they moved. She matched her step to his, 50 yards to the horses. Helena was north, and the silence that had protected Silas Crow for 4 years was about to break. They rode for 3 hours without stopping. Caleb stayed in the saddle through sheer discipline, the kind that lives below. Thought in the muscles and the spine, the trained-in refusal to fall that the army puts into a man, and that doesn't leave him even when everything else starts going sideways. Nell rode tight beside him close enough that she'd know the second before he went down if it came to that. Her left hand stayed on her own reins. Her eyes stayed on him. "Talk to me," she said the first time his head dipped. "I'm fine," he said. "You are not fine. Talk to me anyway." He was quiet for a moment, then, "How many fence posts did Thomas mark?" 14. "I counted on the way back." He planned for a long journey. Caleb's voice was rough but tracking. "Most men hide evidence once and hope for the best. 14 markers means he expected whoever came after him to need time, to need to earn it. That was Thomas," she said. "He planned for the worst and hoped for the best and never once let on which he actually expected." "Good man." "The best I knew," she said. And then, because saying it out loud to someone who hadn't known Thomas but understood what it meant to lose someone worth keeping, she said it cleanly without apology. He deserved better than what happened to him. "He did," Caleb said. "Which is why we're going to make sure it didn't happen for nothing." She looked at the road ahead. At the distance still between them and Coldwater Springs. At the blood soaking steadily through the bandage she'd retied twice already. "Caleb." "Still here." "If you pass out, I cannot get you back on the horse." "Then I won't pass out," he said, as though it were simply a matter of deciding. She wanted to argue with that. She didn't, because somehow, impossibly, it was working. Coldwater Springs was a town that had made its peace with looking the other direction. It wasn't a cruel town. That was the thing Nell had always struggled with. It wasn't that the people were bad. Walt Greer at the general store sent food to sick families in winter. Ida Morse, who ran the boarding house, had let 2 homesteading families stay free after a fire took their place 2 seasons back. Even Sheriff Ben Aldis, who'd written up Thomas's death as an accident, had cried at the funeral. Nell had seen it. She'd been watching faces that day because she couldn't look at the box. But there was a difference between being good in small ways and being brave in the way that cost you something. Coldwater Springs was full of the first kind of good. The second kind had gone thin and scarce ever since black pine money started moving through the territory, the way floodwater moved quietly at first, and then everywhere at once, and then there was no dry ground left. They rode in on the main street at a little past 10 in the morning. Caleb upright and pale and moving carefully, Nell with the ledger inside her coat, and her chin up, like she was daring someone to say something about the state of her. People saw them. Nell watched their faces, watched the exact moment recognition happened. That's the Whitaker widow, the one who's been alone on that mountain claim, and then watched what came after recognition, which was the deliberate slide of eyes away. The sudden interest in the ground. The shopkeeper who'd been sweeping his doorstep who went back inside. The two women on the corner who had been deep in conversation and found something very important to look at across the street. Not cruelty, just the deep human instinct of self-preservation dressed up as indifference. Nell had expected it. It still hit her like a fist. "Don't stop," Caleb said quietly. "I'm not stopping," she said. "Good." They went straight to the sheriff's office. Ben Aldis was at his desk when they came through the door, and the look on his face when he saw Nell and the man beside her blood-stained and hard-eyed was not the look of a corrupt man caught. It was the look of a man who had been dreading this moment and had never quite believed it would stop not coming. He was in his 50s, with a sheriff's star that had been polished recently, which meant someone still cared about the symbol even when the function had gotten complicated. His hands were flat on the desk. He didn't reach for anything. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Sheriff." She set the ledger on his desk, flat, deliberate, the way you set down something that can't be ignored. He looked at it. He didn't touch it. "What is this?" he said. "You know what it is," she said. "You've known something like it existed since the night Thomas died, because a man who falls off a gentle horse on a road he's ridden 100 times doesn't die of an accident, and everyone with eyes knows it." She put both hands on the desk and leaned toward him. "Open it." "Mrs. Whitaker." "Open it, Ben." He opened it. She watched his face while he read, watched it go through stages. Recognition, discomfort, something that might have been the beginning of genuine distress. His eyes moved down the first page and stopped, and he turned back to the beginning and read it again slower. "Names," Caleb said from behind Nell. "Dates, signed orders, including 2 to your predecessor as sheriff authorizing him to misfile a property dispute so the Halverson family would lose their claim." Aldis looked up. "How did Thomas—" "He was a surveyor," Nell said. "He saw the false boundaries. He pulled the original land commission filings and compared them. He documented everything for 14 months. Her voice stayed level. "And then Silas Crow had him killed before he could deliver it." Aldis closed the ledger. His hands were not steady. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, and his voice had changed something underneath it now, something that had been behind a wall for a long time. "I have a wife. I have a daughter in school in Helena. I know," she said. "They've made it very clear to me that—" "I know," she said again, quieter this time. "I know they threatened you, Ben. I know they threatened your family. I know you are not a bad man who did a bad thing. You are a frightened man who did a cowardly thing, and I understand the difference." She straightened up. "But Thomas is dead. The Halverson family lost everything. 2 families burned out of the Southern Valley have nothing. A rail worker was blamed for a murder he didn't commit and spent 2 years in a territorial prison." She held his eyes. "Your fear cost people their lives. I need you to decide right now what your fear is going to cost next." The office was completely silent. Caleb put one hand on the doorframe, which Nell recognized as him, steadying himself and not letting her see how much he needed to. Aldis looked at the ledger, at Nell, at Caleb, back at Nell. He picked up his hat. "I need you to come outside," he said. What happened on the main street of Coldwater Springs that morning was the kind of thing that towns remember differently, depending on who's telling the story later. Sheriff Aldis walked out first, and Nell came beside him, and Caleb came behind, and Aldous stopped in the middle of the street and did something that cost him more than anything he'd done in years. He raised his voice. "I need everyone to stop what they're doing," he said. "Right now. I need everyone who can hear me to stop and listen." People stopped. The way people stop when the law speaks in that particular register, not the official register, not the procedural voice, but the real one, the voice of a man saying something he cannot take back. Silas Crow and the Black Pine Mining Company have been conducting criminal operations in this territory for at least 4 years, Aldous said. "I have a ledger documented evidence that includes land fraud, forged deeds, coerced transfers, and orders for violence against settlers." He paused. "Including the murder of Thomas Whitaker, 14 months ago, on the North Fork Road." Someone in the gathered crowd made a sound, just one person, then silence. Nell stepped forward. She hadn't planned exactly what she was going to say. She'd thought about it on the ride down in the pieces of her mind that weren't occupied with watching Caleb stay upright and watching the trail behind them for pursuit. She'd thought about Thomas's name spoken in a public street. She'd thought about whether her voice would hold. It held. "Thomas Whitaker," she said. "My husband, surveyor, 14 months dead and listed in that ledger as a threat to be removed." She looked at the faces around her. Some she knew, some she didn't, all of them watching. Gunnar Halverson, his wife Maria, their 3 children. Their land was taken with a forged deed while Gunnar was in town buying seed. She didn't look down. She'd memorized the names from the ledger in the 2 hours of riding. The Parker family on the South Creek, burned out in April of last year. Everyone assumed accident. She paused. Wei Lim, a rail worker out of Virginia City, convicted of destroying company property, served time for something Crow's own men did and documented in that ledger. He is still alive, somewhere. He deserves to know. The crowd had gone very still. "Carl Yunt," Nell continued. "Found in a ravine. Called a riding accident. He'd written to the Land Commission 3 weeks before he died." She looked at the sheriff. "I could keep going. There are 11 names confirmed and notation of more, but I think this town has heard enough to decide what it believes." She stopped. The silence lasted long enough that she felt it pressing on her from all sides, felt the weight of all that looking away, all those years of collective survival dressed up as polite indifference. And then a woman's voice said from somewhere to the left, "I can speak to the Halverson deed." Her name was Ruth Calper, a widow like Nell, though 15 years further down that road. She'd lived on the property adjacent to the Halversons, and she'd watched the company men arrive with papers that Maria Halverson had wept over, right there in Ruth's kitchen, saying the signatures were wrong, the dates were wrong, none of it was right, and no one would listen. Ruth stepped out of the crowd with the deliberateness of someone who has been rehearsing a step for a long time, and finally decided the stage was ready. "I watched Maria Halverson sign that transfer," she said loud enough for the street to hear. "She signed under duress. 2 men stood in the room and one of them had his hand on a rifle. I was there. I have been afraid to say so for 14 months. She looked at Nell. "I'm not afraid today." Nell looked at her. Couldn't speak for a second, nodded. Then, Walt Greer. Walt Greer, who sent food to sick families and swept his own doorstep, walked out from the general store and said without looking at anyone in particular, "I repaired a wheel on Crow's supply wagon. The night of the Parker fire. 2 in the morning he came to my back door and paid triple rate and told me to forget he'd been there." His voice was not comfortable. It was the voice of a man who has been living with something lodged in his chest and has finally decided the cost of keeping it there is higher than the cost of getting it out. "I forgot about it. I'm not forgetting now." Aldous was writing. Another man. Nell didn't know him. A young man with a deputy's bearing who wasn't wearing a badge came forward and said he'd been a deputy under the previous sheriff, and that there were 2 graves on the old mining company land that hadn't been recorded anywhere official, and he could show someone exactly where. Each person who stepped forward made it infinitesimally easier for the next one. That was how silence broke. not all at once. Person by person, the way a frozen creek broke in spring, one crack, then another, and then the whole thing moving. Aldous looked up from his writing. His face had changed in the last 20 minutes. He still looked frightened. But underneath the fear, something else had come up. Something that looked like a man remembering who he'd thought he was going to be when he took the job. "I need to send a wire to Helena," he said. "Already sent," said a voice from the back of the crowd. Everyone turned. Reverend Aldous Peel sat on his swayback mare at the edge of the gathering Bible in his saddlebag, dusty from a very hard ride, and looking entirely unrepentant about it. "I rode through the night," he said conversationally. "Sent a wire to Judge Elias Marsh at first light from the Timber Creek station. Federal deputies are already moving." He looked at Nell with the expression of a man who had done the thing he was put on earth to do, and found it surprisingly satisfying. "I told you I would remember every word of that conversation, Mrs. Whitaker." Nell stared at him. Caleb behind her made a sound that might have been a laugh, if he'd had more energy for it. "You rode through this night," Nell said. "The Lord provides good night vision to those on righteous business," Peel said. "Also, I know the road." The first of Crow's surviving men was arrested before noon. Tom Rusk, who had been the watcher in Nell's tree line who had ridden away that first day when Caleb leveled the Colt at him, was found at the Coldwater Springs livery, saddling a horse with the focused urgency of a man who had heard public testimony and correctly calculated his next destination should be elsewhere. Aldous put him in a cell without ceremony. The second, a man nobody in town recognized who turned out to be from Virginia City, was arrested at the hotel. He didn't resist. He sat down on the bed and put his face in his hands and said he wanted to talk to someone who could make him a deal. And Aldous told him the only deal available right now was the truth. And the man said that was fine actually because he had quite a lot of it. Pike was still on the mountain last seen cursing and cradling his re-injured wrist. Aldous sent 2 deputies. And Crow. Crow was in the hotel dining room when the sheriff's deputies came for him. He was having coffee, which Nell later learned he did every morning regardless of circumstances. A discipline, some said, or a performance which amounted to the same thing in a man like Silas Crow. He looked at the deputies, and he looked at the ledger under Aldous's arm, and he put down his coffee cup with perfect composure. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Possibly," Aldous said. "I've made several. This isn't one of them." Crow stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked past the deputies, past Aldous toward the door and the street beyond it, and Nell was standing in that doorway because she'd simply known that this moment needed a witness, that someone needed to be there who had paid the full price of it. He looked at her. "This changes nothing of substance," he said. Not angry, not afraid, just stating what he believed was fact. "Companies like Blackpine don't die from paperwork. The land stays. The operations continue. The men who run them find other arrangements." "Maybe," Nell said. "But the men who run them don't get to do it from here anymore." She held his gaze. "And Thomas's name is on a public record now, his real name, not what you called him." Something moved behind Crow's eyes. That thing she'd seen once before at the rope bridge. That cold, instinctive flash of something almost like recognition. A man who has never been truly opposed suddenly understanding what opposition actually feels like. The deputies walked him out. Nell stepped aside to let them pass. She did not move out of his way. She made the doorway narrower deliberately, and he had to turn slightly sideways to get through it, and she watched him go, and she did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter than that. Something that lived below triumph and above grief and didn't have an easy name. It felt like a debt being recorded, if not yet paid. It felt like her husband's name, said out loud in public, where it couldn't be buried again. Caleb was at the edge of all of it. She found him on the bench outside the sheriff's office, which was where he'd gone after the street gathering. Without telling her, she'd turned to say something to Ruth Cowper, and he'd simply been gone, and her heart had done something sharp and alarming before she found him sitting with his hands loose on his knees and his eyes closed. "Caleb." He opened his eyes. They were clear, which was something. "You sat down," she said. Seemed appropriate, he said. She looked at his side. The bandage was dark, too dark. We need the doctor. I know. Now, Caleb. I know that too. He didn't move immediately. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the careful flatness he wore like armor, not the precise professional attention, but something underneath both of those. Something tired and honest and unexpectedly open. You did that, he said. In there. You did that. We did that, she said. No, he said. I was upright. You did it. He paused. Thomas built the case. Peel rode through the night. Aldous found his spine after years of losing it. But you're the reason any of it moved. You walked into that street and you said their names and you made the silence cost more than speaking. He looked away, then back. That's not something you learn. That's something you are. She stood very still for a moment. Then she said, If you bleed to death on this bench, I will be extremely irritated with you. Noted, he said. Get up. He got up. She put her shoulder under his left arm and they walked to the doctor's office. 3 buildings down, which was the same as everything else. The same as the fence mending, the same as the shooting lesson, the same as the rocky ground of Widow's Pass. 2 people doing a hard thing together, neither one carrying more than they agreed to. Neither one pretending the weight wasn't real. Dr. Hames was a thin, precise man who had refused to treat 2 homesteading families last spring because Black Pine's company doctor had told him not to treat anyone involved in land disputes, and he had complied, and he had known at the time it was wrong, and he had done it anyway. Nell knew this. She walked Caleb through his door anyway, because this was not the moment for old accounting. This was the moment for the next right thing. Hames took one look at Caleb's side and went professional immediately, which was its own kind of courage. He asked Nell to wait outside. She waited inside instead, in the chair nearest the door, with the ledger on her lap, and her hands flat on its cover, and her eyes on the middle distance that meant she was somewhere else. Somewhere that was part past, and part future, and part the particular grief of people who have fought hard for something, and reached the moment after the fighting and don't yet know how to inhabit the quiet. Ruth Calper came and sat beside her after a while. Didn't say anything. Just sat. The particular company of women who understand that some things don't need narrating. After an hour, Hames came out and said the bullet had gone clean through and missed the important things, and the patient was going to be sore and furious for several weeks, but was not in his professional opinion going to die from it. Nell put her hands over her face for exactly 5 seconds. Then she put them down and said, "Can I see him?" Caleb was conscience-stitched and deeply unhappy about being horizontal. "I can ride," he said immediately. "No," she said. "The deputies need the ledger in Helena. Peel already wired the judge. Federal deputies are coming." She sat in the chair beside the bed. "You can let someone else carry something for the next 24 hours. He looked at the ceiling. "I don't like being horizontal human in need of assistance." She raised an eyebrow. "You slept on my porch for 6 days in 100-degree heat rather than ask to come inside. I think we can agree that your comfort with accepting help is limited." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement that one was possible. "You're not wrong," he said. "I know," she said. They were quiet for a moment. Through the window, they could hear the town voices' movement, the ordinary sounds of a place that had been holding its breath and was beginning to exhale. "What does this feel like?" Caleb asked, not asking for himself, asking about her. She thought about it honestly. "Like something enormous happened," she said. "And also like Thomas is still gone." She looked at the ledger on her lap. I think I believed somewhere underneath everything that getting this done would feel like justice, like the scales balancing, but it doesn't feel like that." She paused. "It just feels like the truth got told, which is important, which matters. It's just not the same as the wound closing." Caleb nodded slowly. "No, it never is." "Did you find that?" she said. "After what happened in the Judith Basin, after you left. I found that the thing I did was right," he said carefully, "and that being right didn't stop the nightmares. Both of those things were true at the same time. I spent a while thinking I had to choose between them." He looked at the window. "You don't. You just carry both." She looked at him for a moment, at the lines of his face in the afternoon light, at the man who had fixed her door and slept on her porch and taught her to shoot at distance and stood in front of 6 men with a hole in his side and said, "I'll do my best," when she told him not to get shot. "Caleb," she said. Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I'm choosing to. There's a difference." She looked at him directly. "You came for a ledger. You got considerably more complicated than that." "I did," he agreed. "And you stayed anyway." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw him deciding the same way he'd decided in the cabin on the first day how much truth to offer, but different now. Because 6 days of hard country and shared danger had changed the terms of what truth meant between them. "Because you were worth staying for," he said simply. "And because Thomas Whitaker's wife deserved someone who would see this through." He paused. "And because by about day 3, I stopped thinking of them as separate reasons." The afternoon light moved across the floor. Outside Coldwater Springs continued its careful, tentative, remarkable process of remembering that it had a conscience. And inside a small room above a doctor's office, Eleanor Whitaker held a dead man's ledger in her lap and sat beside a living man who had chosen her not to rescue, not to own, not to manage, and let herself feel for the first time in 14 months that the locked door inside her chest had opened 1 careful inch. Just 1. But 1 was enough to feel the air come through. The federal deputies from Helena would arrive by morning. The ledger would go north. The judge would read the names. The silence already cracked wide open on a public street in a small Montana town would not close again. Thomas Whitaker's name was in the record now. The real record. The one that didn't belong to Blackpine. Nell sat with that fact the way you sit with something that has cost everything quietly, and without rushing, and with the particular dignity of a woman who has earned every inch of the ground she is standing on. She was not finished, but she had started something that could not be unstarted. And for now, that was enough. The federal deputies arrived at dawn the way serious men always arrived, without fanfare, without announcement. Just the sound of multiple horses on the main road. And then they were simply there. 7 of them. Badges catching the early light, led by a deputy marshal named Garrett Cross, who had the lean, unhurried look of a man who had ridden a very long way and would ride considerably further without complaint. Caleb heard them from inside the doctor's office where he'd spent the night horizontal and deeply dissatisfied about it. He was sitting up when Nell came through the door at sunrise, and she looked at him and said, "Don't," before he could stand. "I wasn't going to." "You were absolutely going to," she said. "They're here. It's handled. Lie back down." He lay back down with the expression of a man who was doing it voluntarily as a personal choice, not because anyone told him to. 7 deputies, she said. "Cross wants the ledger and both of us in Helena for formal testimony before the judge. He says Crow's company lawyers are already moving. They filed a counterclaim last night, something about the ledger being illegally obtained." She paused. "He also says that won't work, but that we need to be in that courtroom." Caleb looked at the ceiling. "When do we ride?" "Tomorrow morning, when you can sit a horse without bleeding through your stitches." "I can sit a horse right now." "You can fall off a horse right now," she said. "Those are different things." He looked at her. She looked back. The particular equilibrium of 2 people who have stopped performing patience with each other and started actually practicing it. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She set a cup of coffee on the bedside table. Real coffee, not the thin stuff, because Walt Greer at the general store had pressed it on her that morning without being asked, with the slightly desperate generosity of a man making small reparations for large silences. And she sat in the chair, and they were quiet together, in the way they'd learned to be quiet, which was without discomfort and without pretending the quiet meant nothing. "What does the testimony involve?" Caleb said. "Everything," she said. "What Thomas found. How I found his notes. The attacks on the claim. Widow's Pass." She turned the cup in her hands. "They want me to name the names. Out loud. In a court. On the record." "Can you do that?" She didn't answer immediately. She thought about standing in the main street of Coldwater Springs with her hands empty and her voice level and 11 names in her mouth. She thought about how it had felt, not clean, not triumphant, but necessary. The way breathing was necessary. The way the creek running was necessary. The way some things simply had to happen, regardless of what they cost. "Yes," she said. "I can do that." They rode north the next morning. Caleb rode with his jaw set and his posture deliberate in the way of a man managing pain by refusing to acknowledge it publicly. Nell rode beside him and did not comment on the set of his jaw, which was the most considerate thing she could have done, and she knew it. Deputy Marshal Cross rode point. His men flanked the column. Between them, wrapped in oilcloth and carried in Cross's own saddlebag, as official federal evidence, was Thomas Whitaker's ledger. It was the first time since Widow's Pass that it had been out of Nell's coat. She felt its absence as a physical thing, a lightness that wasn't quite relief, not yet. More like the particular feeling of having carried something so long that putting it down changed your posture before it changed your mind. "Strange, isn't it?" Caleb said, riding close. "What is?" "Watching someone else carry it." She looked at him sideways. "You read minds now." "I read people," he said. "It's related, but different." She faced forward. "It feels right," she said after a moment. "It feels like it's going where it was always supposed to go." Thomas would agree. Thomas would be insufferably satisfied, she said. He always was when a plan worked. He'd never say "I told you so" directly. He'd just get this look. She stopped, swallowed. This particular smile. Caleb said nothing, which was exactly right. They rode hard and reached Helena by the second afternoon. The Territorial Courthouse was a building that took itself seriously, solid stone-high windows. The architecture of a place that wanted to announce it had opinions about order and civilization. Nell had never been inside it. She stood on the steps and looked at it for a moment before they went in, and Caleb stood beside her and didn't rush her. "Ready," he said. "I've been ready for 14 months, she said. "I just didn't know it yet." They went in. Judge Elias Marsh was a man in his 60s who had the deeply weathered look of someone who had presided over enough human capacity for both goodness and catastrophe that very little surprised him anymore. He read the ledger in 2 hours. Nell knew when he reached the worst of it because his face went very still in the way that meant a man of long experience was making an effort at composure. He looked up at Nell across his desk. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "your husband was a meticulous man." "He was," she said. "The documentation here is sufficient to open formal proceedings against 6 named individuals and the Black Pine Mining Company as a corporate entity." He folded his hands. "However, Crow's attorneys have already submitted a counter-document, a version of what they're calling the authentic company ledger, which they claim shows entirely legal transactions and no evidence of wrongdoing." The room went quiet. Caleb sat forward. "A fake," he said. "They're claiming it's the original and that yours is the forgery." Marsh looked at Nell. "The burden will fall to us to prove otherwise, which means we need something this ledger has that theirs cannot replicate." Nell looked at the ledger on the judge's desk, at the leather cover, at the 2 words on the back in Thomas's careful hand. And then she thought about Thomas, about a man who planned for the worst, who marked 14 fence posts, who cut a floorboard, and wrote a letter addressed to a future he hoped wouldn't come. A man who had been a surveyor. A man whose entire professional life was built on the principle that every authentic record contained within it proof of its own authenticity. "May I look at it?" she said. Marsh slid it across. She opened it to the back pages, the survey appendix, the technical notations that she'd understood as evidence but hadn't looked at as craft. Thomas's handwriting, his numbers. And there, in the bottom right corner of the final page, in a hand so small, she'd needed the light at a certain angle to see it at all. A cipher, not elaborate, not hidden with any particular drama. Just a sequence of numbers that corresponded to boundary markers on the original Territorial Land Commission, filing a filing that was publicly registered, publicly accessible, publicly unalterable, and which, if you matched those numbers to the Commission records, produced a verification key that was physically impossible to replicate, without access to records that predated Black Pine's operation in the territory by 11 years. Thomas had signed his own work. The way a surveyor signed every authentic map with a verification that lived outside the document itself, tethered to a public record that no one could forge after the fact. Nell set the ledger down. "Page 47, she said. "Bottom right corner. My husband embedded a cipher key tied to the original 1871 Territorial Land Commission boundary filings. Those are federal records. They cannot be altered." She looked at Judge Marsh. "Match those numbers to the Commission records, and you'll have authentication that no company lawyer can argue against in front of a jury." The judge looked at the page, at the numbers, at Nell. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said slowly. "How did you know to look for that?" She thought about a man who planned 14 fence posts, who cut a floorboard, who said the air is cleaner up there, and meant something truer underneath it. "Because I knew Thomas," she said. "He never submitted work he hadn't already proven twice." The hearing took 3 days. Nell testified for 4 hours on the second day. Crow's lawyer was a polished man from Virginia City, who used long words the way some men used weapons, casually, confidently, with the assumption that they would land where aimed. He questioned the reliability of her memory. He questioned her emotional state as a widow. He suggested, delicately, professionally, with the skill of a man who had done this before, that grief sometimes produced certainty where there was only wish. Nell waited until he finished each question. She answered in complete sentences. She did not raise her voice. She did not waver on a single date, a single name, a single sequence of events from the first day Crow's men arrived at her cabin to the moment she picked up a ledger from beneath a hearthstone on a summer morning in the mountains. When the lawyer suggested her testimony was colored by personal animosity, she said, "My testimony is colored by the 14 months I spent running a mountain claim alone after my husband was murdered, during which time I became an extremely precise observer of what actually happened, as opposed to what powerful men found convenient to call it. The two are different. The ledger distinguishes between them. I recommend reading it carefully." The courtroom had gone so quiet that the sound of the judge's pen moving on paper was audible from the back row. Caleb watched from the gallery. He had both hands on the rail in front of him, and his face was completely still, and his eyes hadn't left her since she sat down. When she stepped down from the stand, she walked past the gallery without looking up. But she knew he was there. The way you know where a fire is in a dark room, not by looking, just by the warmth. On the third day, the Land Commission archivist confirmed the cipher key. Thomas Whitaker's verification numbers matched the 1871 federal boundary records exactly. Black Pine's counter ledger contained no such key because you could not forge a key tied to 11-year-old federal records without access to records that predated your crime by a decade. The authentication was irrefutable. Crow sat at the defendant's table and watched it happen with the expression of a man who had built an empire on the assumption that enough money made truth flexible and who was discovering too late that some things were not flexible. That a dead surveyor's careful hand and a cipher embedded in public records, and a widow who had memorized every word of her husband's work, constituted a form of truth that money genuinely could not bend. He was remanded for federal criminal trial on 6 counts. His company's operations in Montana Territory were suspended pending investigation. It was not perfect. Nell had told Caleb that it wouldn't be, and she'd been right. Trials took time. Appeals existed. Money was patient. Some of the men named in the ledger had enough distance between themselves and the documented crimes that prosecution would be complicated and uncertain. But the names were in the public record. The crimes were documented. The silence that had protected Silas Crow for 4 years was shattered past reassembling. And Wei Lim, the rail worker who had served 2 years for a crime documented in the ledger as having been committed by Crow's own men, was located in a mining camp outside Butte, alive and thin and disbelieving when the federal deputy told him why they'd come. When he was told about the ledger, about the entry that proved his innocence in writing in the hand of the very man who had ordered his wrongful conviction, he sat down on the ground and put his face in his hands and stayed that way for a long time. The deputy who brought him north said later that he'd never seen a man so quiet, so long, and then stand up so straight. Nell heard that story in the hallway outside the courtroom, and she pressed her hand flat against the wall and breathed through it, because some things hit you sideways after the fighting is over, when the armor comes off, and there's nothing left between you and the full weight of what was done and what was finally partially imperfectly undone. Caleb found her there. He didn't say anything. He just came and stood beside her the same way Ruth Calper had sat beside her in the doctor's office, present solid, not requiring anything from the moment. After a while, she straightened up and said, "I want to go home." "Then let's go home," he said. The ride back took 4 days. They took it slow because Caleb's side was healing, and the mountain roads were hard, and because after everything that had happened, there was something in both of them that needed the pace of something unhurried. They camped 2 nights on the trail, and the summer was finally beginning to turn, not cooler exactly, not yet, but different, the particular quality of late August light that was still hot, but no longer punishing like the season had made its point, and was willing to ease up. They talked more on that ride than they had in all the days before. Not about the ledger or the court or Crow. About other things. The kind of things that come up when 2 people have stopped performing caution at each other and started simply talking. He told her about a river in the Judith Basin that he'd camped by for a week after leaving the army, when he'd had nothing, and didn't know what came next, and how the sound of moving water had been the most honest thing in the world at that particular moment. She told him about the first winter alone when the temperature had dropped to 40 below, and the well had frozen, and she'd moved her bedroll next to the stove, and read every book Thomas had left, and then read them again, and told herself each morning that the only requirement for the day was to still be alive at the end of it. "You made it through that alone," he said. "I made it through that," she said. The alone part was the worst part, not the cold. He was quiet for a moment. "What's the cabin need?" he said. "The east fence line wants another section replaced. The roof over the lean-to has a soft spot. Henry needs his hooves looked at by someone who knows horses better than I do." She paused. "The winter wood isn't in yet." "That's a significant amount of work," he said. "It's always a significant amount of work," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking because I'd like to help with it." She looked at the road ahead. At the mountains above them, going gold at the tops, where the light hit differently. At the long distance between where they were and where she needed to be. "Caleb," she said. "Cross offered you something in Helena, before we left." A pause. "You were across the room," he said. "I have good eyes." Another pause longer. "Deputy Marshal position. Territorial. The investigation into Black Pine opened up a need for someone who knows the high country and doesn't owe anyone money or favors." "That's a real position," she said. "That's steady work. That's something." "It is," he said. "And..." He rode for a moment without answering. She let him. She'd learned that his silences were never evasions. They were the sound of a man actually thinking, which was rare enough that she'd come to value it. "And I told him I needed to ask someone's opinion before I decided," he said. She turned to look at him. "I told him there was a mountain claim above Coldwater Springs," Caleb said, "that the owner was trying to get her winter wood in, and had a section of fence line down, and a mule with bad hooves, and that I had a prior commitment that needed considering." "You told a federal deputy marshal that you had a prior commitment to a mule." "I mentioned the mule in passing," he said. "The commitment is to the person who owns the mule." Nell faced forward again. Her heart was doing something complicated that she didn't have immediate words for, something that involved the letter still carried inside her coat, and the cipher Thomas had embedded in a public record, and the image of a man sleeping on a porch in 100-degree heat because he'd been told not to come inside and had respected it absolutely. Something that involved all of it at once, which was too much to sort out on horseback on a mountain road. "The deputy marshal position covers the whole territory," she said. "It does. That would include Black Pine's ongoing investigation, the trial, making sure the county doesn't quietly revert to old habits once the federal attention moves on." "Yes," he said. "It would involve that. Which means you'd be working in this region, specifically." "Frequently," he said. "And you'd need somewhere to base out of," she said. "In the high country, somewhere central to the territory." He said nothing. "The Whitaker claim is central to the territory," she said. "I checked the survey maps." A pause. "Thomas's survey maps, which are very accurate." "I'm certain they are," Caleb said. She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, and there was something on his face that she recognized now, that thing that was close to a smile, the acknowledgement that one was available, and he was choosing to let it come. "I'm not asking you to stay," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking." "I know," he said. "I'm offering a professional arrangement," she said. "A base of operations for a territorial deputy marshal who happens to know the high passes and the hidden trails and the fence lines of a specific mountain claim in considerable detail." "A professional arrangement," he said. "With room and board." "Naturally." "And coffee." "I assumed." She paused. "And I'm tired of locked doors," she said. Simply, without performance or decoration. "I'm tired of the locked doors, Caleb." He reined his horse to a stop. She stopped beside him. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the man with the rifle on the first day, direct and clear, and with nothing behind it that wasn't also in front of it. No performance, no armor, just a man who had learned a long time ago that honesty cost less in the long run than its opposite. "Nell," he said, "I am tired of empty trails." She nodded once. They rode on. Odd. They reached the cabin on a Thursday afternoon in late August. The yard was as she'd left it, the mended fence, the patched water trough, the porch, where Caleb had slept 6 nights running in the July heat. Henry the mule came to the fence and regarded Caleb with what might have been recognition, or might have been the standard suspicion he extended to everyone. He accepted a piece of dried apple and flicked one ear forward, which was as close to affection as Henry got. Nell stood in the yard and looked at her cabin. The door Caleb had rehung still hung true. The window on the east side was still the one she'd been meaning to reglaze for 2 seasons. The lean-to roof still had its soft spot. The gap in the east fence line was still there because she hadn't had time before Widow's Pass, and then things had accelerated considerably. It was still a claim on the edge of hard country, in a territory that had tried to take it from her by violence and paperwork and loneliness and sheer accumulated weight. It was still hers. She put her hand on the porch rail, the same rail she'd leaned against 100 mornings, the same wood that had weathered the same brutal summers and the same killing winters, the same wood Thomas had cut and planed and set himself 12 years ago, when this place was new and the future was unwritten. "Needs work," Caleb said beside her. "Always does," she said. "Where do you want to start?" She looked at the fence line, at the lean-to, at the woodpile that wasn't nearly high enough for winter, at the whole considerable, impossible, necessary work of keeping a thing alive in country that didn't make it easy. "The fence first," she said. "Then the roof, then the wood." "In that order," he said. "In that order," she agreed. "And Caleb." She turned to him. "Come inside." He took off his hat. He stepped through the door, and Eleanor Whitaker stood on her porch for one moment alone. Just long enough to let the full weight of everything that had happened in the last weeks settle through her, to feel the particular completeness of a thing that has been carried a long way and finally set down in the right place. And she looked at the mountains, at the late summer light on the high ridges where the summer cattle line ran, where a hearthstone had hidden the truth for 14 months, where the truth had finally been retrieved. She thought about what Silas Crow had said, that widows don't change the world. She thought about what she had answered, that they remember where the bodies are buried. She thought about Thomas, not his absence, not yet, but his presence. The way he'd embedded a cipher in public records because he trusted that the right person would know to look for it. The way he'd written, "For Nell, if I don't come home." The way he'd called her Eleanor when he was being serious, when he meant every word. He had known at the end what she was capable of. He had known better than she had. The late August sun moved across the yard. Inside, she could hear Caleb moving careful, unhurried, learning the geography of a place he'd decided to stay in. And the sound of that, the ordinary human sound of someone moving through the same space as her, was the thing that finally broke the locked door all the way open. Not with grief. With something warmer and harder to name and more durable than anything she'd felt in 14 months. She turned and went inside. Behind her, the door stayed open. Because out there, in a land that had spent years teaching people to suffer in silence, Eleanor Whitaker had learned that the bravest thing in the world was not the moment you fought back, and not the moment you named the names in a public street, and not even the moment you pulled an anchor rope on a rope bridge over a 30-foot drop with nothing in your hands but the truth. The bravest thing was the door you left open afterward, the one that said, "I survived the worst of it, and I chose with full knowledge of what choosing cost to let someone decent walk through." She had survived. She had chosen. And Caleb Ryder, mountain cowboy, former Army scout, a man of weathered hat and patient hands, and the particular stubborn decency of someone who slept on a 100-degree porch, rather than cross a line he'd been asked not to cross, he had walked through. Some things in this life break you. And some things, if you fight hard enough and long enough and refuse to let go of what's true, even when the weight of it might take you under, some things you get to build again. Stronger this time, with better company. And a door that stays open.